So thank you so much for the time. I will take between 15 minutes to do the presentation so that we can have time to questions and some clarifications. So essentially what I'm going to present is first start with the context where we were before the war in Ukraine and what were the effects of COVID-19. And then I will go in detail in the war in Ukraine and where we see the risks are and what we can do to minimize those risks. And there will be an emphasis on, as you requested, on Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. So first on the impacts of COVID-19, and this is a big difference relative to the 2007-2011 food crisis, because the problem there was a financial crisis, which affected mostly the developed countries, not the developing countries. What we face with COVID-19 is a period in which the recovery has benefited high-income countries, but not necessarily has been able to achieve in middle and low-income countries. And the best example of this is the permanent drop in real income that Sub-Saharan Africa faces, which is in the bottom chart, where in the solid line, where basically you can see that the projection of the recovery is far from what they were supposed to be in the trend pre to the COVID-19. This is very different to advanced economies, where they are even expected to surpass what they were doing before. And of course, this is before the Ukraine crisis. The second photo is, okay, what happened with extreme poverty? And it has completely turned around and has increased 97 million people more in extreme poverty. And most of it is on informal sector, people moving from not being poor to poor because of the lockdowns and the slowdowns of the economies. And of course, this is affecting South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. But one of the topics that really worries us is the significant increase in inequalities. No, the real GDP per capita, as I said before, has been not so good for this region. But if you look at the graph in the right-hand side, you will see that all the red vertical lines are worsening inequality, and most of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa are showing a significant worsening in inequalities. And this brings a huge challenge, because if we already started from high inequality levels, and this gets even worse, then could put the situation in something very unsustainable, because the only way you can move out of poverty and out of undernourishment is reducing inequalities. In terms of undernourishment, after a long trend of decreasing prevalence and relative unchanging number of undernourished people, both began to rise in Africa in 2014, and the new estimates show a significant increase, and this will be updated with the new SOFI, but the numbers are pretty well projected. They are really fitting what we are observing now. Even in some cases, we will observe an increase. And when we look at the sub-regional level in Africa, we see that the major effects were in Western Africa, followed by South Africa, and then all the regions in general had a significant increase. The consequence in the long term is basically that we expect that the projections of the number of undernourishment globally and at the regional level confirm the enormous challenge of eradicating hunger by 2030. But the evolution between 2020 and 2030 in terms of numbers of undernourished people is quite different across regions. And a significant increase is forecast for Africa, where the number is projected to reach 300 million people, placing it at the same level as Asia. And that's what you can observe between the red and the green line. So Africa is projected to be the region with the highest number of undernourished people, even in the absence of COVID-19 pandemic. And if you add to this the medium and long-term effects of climate, of course, most of the regions that are going to be mostly affected by climate are in these countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and therefore the challenge will be even bigger. And that shows again the interconnectedness of the agri-food system with the environment and the energy market and the health world. Now, in this context, that we already had numbers going up of chronic undernourishment up to 161 million more people because of COVID-19, reductions of GDP per capita, huge inequalities, we now face a new challenge, which is the challenge of the Ukraine and Russian war. Why is this so important, and why we need to look at this carefully? Because Russian Federation and Ukraine are key exporters. It could be that in production level, they are not so high, but they are very high in terms of surpluses of export. So if we look at wheat, the Russian Federation is the top exporter of wheat, and Ukraine is the 6th exporter of wheat in the world. If we look at barley, Ukraine is the 3rd, Russian Federation the 4th. If we look at maize, Ukraine is the 3rd, and Russian Federation is the 6th or the 7th. If we look at rapeseeds, Ukraine is the third. And if we look at sunflower, Ukraine is the first and Russian Federation the third. In cereals, we are talking of them exporting in a year 30% of the world cereals. In sunflower, 63% of the world sunflower. Now, today also, we have Russian Federation has a huge role on fertilizers. They are the top exporter of N fertilizer, the third exporter of P fertilizer, and the second exporter in the world of K fertilizer. And this is extremely important because we depend substantially on these inputs for food production. So our major concern is that the next planting season could be severely affected if we continue with the restriction of access to fertilizers from the Russian Federation. But let's look at the countries which depend first on the wheat. And here I put in red Sub-Saharan Africa, but basically some countries are heavily reliant on imports from Ukraine and Russian Federation. And these include big wheat importers such as Turkey and Egypt, North Africa, but it also includes a number of countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, shaded here in red. Eritrea, for instance, receives all of its wheat from Ukraine and Russia, Somalia, 90%, Madagascar, 70%, Tanzania, Congo, and Namibia receive 60%. In the world, we have 50 countries with at least 30% imports from these two countries, and from those, 20 import more than 50%. So there is a huge import dependency on these two countries' production of wheat, and the same applies to maize. Sunflower is even higher. Now, but what is the situation in 2022, today? The situation is that of that 30%, a big share has already been exported before the conflict. What is pending to be exported and is shaded in dashed red lines in this graph. So in wheat, we are talking of 8 million metric tons of a total of close to 35 from Russian Federation and 6 million metric tons from Ukraine. In the case of maize, we're talking of 14 million metric tons from Ukraine and 2.5 million metric tons from Russia Federation. So, which tell us that this year, the problem is not necessarily so high. Just to put in context, India increased exports of wheat in 7 million metric tons, which essentially covered the gap from Ukraine, or from Russian Federation, sorry. But the other gap can be covered by other countries or partially covered, and the same in the case of maize. So in 2022, if the war stops tomorrow, we could be okay, and the prices have already absorbed that gap. Now, if we look at the wheat as a staple food in North Africa, it's in North Africa, but not in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this graph is showing what is the kilocalorie per capita per day imports of Sub-Saharan Africa in the world. As you can see, North Africa, they have a high imports, but Sub-Saharan Africa is not so high, and only some of the countries in the coastal areas are importers. So basically what we are saying is that there are other staples which are relevant for Sub-Saharan Africa, which are cassava for sure, and also rice. They import a lot of rice, but rice from both Thailand in the West Africa and Vietnam, and in East Africa from India and Bangladesh are in good situation. There is significant surplus this year. So the problem, the serious problem will come if this situation continues for next year, which is what we are expecting now, because the war could destroy all the production and all the remaining harvest from Ukraine and will not allow the next planting season for Ukraine. And it could be that Russian Federation cannot import the seeds and pesticides, which they are completely dependent, 60% from Europe and other countries outside of Russia. And if they don't are able to get those, then the next planting season for that continent, for that country will also be affected. So what that means, if this is true and we go to the extreme situation, means that 30% of the surpluses that were exported in the world of cereals will disappear, 63% of the surpluses of sunflower will disappear, plus because of the lower use of fertilizers, because of the higher prices and lack of availability, the rest of the world, key exporting countries, will produce less. So the next year situation could be pretty bad unless we find a solution in the next months before the planting season in these countries. Now, markets are reflecting this, and the food price index of FAO has reached in March the highest ever level, both in nominal and real terms. And the major increase has been in oilseeds and in cereals. And this is the highest level ever since 1990 when this index was created. And it's even higher in real nominal terms than in the crisis of 1970s. So the situation already is in the markets. The major concern, as I mentioned, is also fertilizers. No, that's for us a bigger problem because it affects not only these two countries, but affects the world and the key exporting countries. So what holds in wheat holds for fertilizer. Cameroon, Ghana, Ivory Coast are among the most vulnerable countries relying heavily on supplies from Russia. On the positive side, Africa only accounts from 3 to 4% of the global fertilizer consumption. That's very important because the intensity of use of fertilizer in Africa is very low. Even they have a big plant of fertilizers in Nigeria, which exports 85% of its production to Latin America for different reasons. But what I wanted to mention here is that, yes, they depend, but the levels are pretty low compared to Latin America and to Asia. Now, on the other side of concerns, the yield enhancing effects of fertilizers are huge in sub-Saharan Africa, and many farmers produce at the low end of the yield curve, where marginal gains from higher fertilizer applications can create significant gains. But the problem we are facing is that the affordability today of fertilizers is declining enormously, and this is the last part of this graph. And this is because of the energy fertilizer nexus, which has increased the cost of fertilizers. Despite there has been a decrease in the last weeks on the gas price, still the affordability keeps declining, and there is only a very marginal improvement. So let me also emphasize that wheat is not an important foodstuff in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, as I mentioned. So we need to look at this carefully, but basically what we are saying here is that the fertilizer problem is one which is extremely important. Now, in this context, how we look at the risks that we are facing. FAO decided to split the risk in 3 groups. The humanitarian, which is directly linked to Ukraine, the people in Ukraine to assure their food security, the people moving out of Ukraine, more than 7 million because of displacements, looking at their food security, and also the people at the countries which are in food crisis that will be in an emergency situation, IPC phase, or cadre harmonisé, bigger than 3, and therefore we need to help them through food assistance and through other mechanisms. That's the humanitarian part. And our emergency group with other partners are working on this intensively. But there are other 2 blocks which are more linked to the medium and long term and also the short term in terms of production. And those are in food and agriculture and what we call the macro risks. In food and agriculture, the major concern we have is on inputs, both of fertilizers, which is central right now, but also on seeds and pesticides. Why? Because that will affect production in the world, that will reduce yields in the world, and will also affect availability of food. Today, in difference to 2007, 2008, 2011, we have availability of food. We have a lot better stocks, but they are very concentrated. But still, the shock that we are facing today was the reason of the increases in prices. But next year could be completely different if yields go down and Ukraine and Russia Federation are taken out of the equation. And this, of course, is related to trade and the importance of avoiding export restrictions. Like, for example, sunflower is, because of 63% of the exports are constrained right now, the potential export restriction that Indonesia was trying to put over palm oil will exacerbate enormously oilseed prices. And we hope that they will move backwards. They have argued that they will move backwards, but it still is not clear. They are arguing on 40% export restriction. So we need to look at that very carefully. But we need to avoid other countries to put export restrictions, like what happened in the 2007, 2008, 2011, where the export restrictions exacerbated enormously the problem. Today, we don't have yet that situation. We have 12 or so countries putting some restrictions, but we need to avoid that. And that's where AMIS can play a significant role, the Agricultural Market Information System. Because everything happens in production or in inputs or in trade will be reflected in prices. Now, we are also looking at the logistical infrastructure, not only the mobility on the Black Sea, which is not only Ukraine and Russia Federation, but also the logistics within Ukraine and how much the damage will make it impossible for them to sell what they have and to produce what they need to produce for next year. And finally, the disease issue. And this is really important because Ukraine had endemic African swine fever and other zoonotic diseases. As the conflict pushes animals out, we need to increase early warning tools and observation in the border countries to avoid the disease to spread, because that could affect bordering European countries. So we need to be very careful on that. On the macro side, the most important one is the energy links. The energy links not on the traditional between biofuel and food, which was and could be again relevant when the oil price goes higher than $100, but especially the relationship between energy and fertilizers. So for example, if Europe decides to stop imports from energy from Russian Federation, that automatically will make producers of fertilizers in Europe to switch from using gas for fertilizer production to consumption. And that will reduce again the supply of fertilizers from a key exporting region, which is Europe, which will be an addition to the problem of Russian Federation not exporting and Belarus not exporting fertilizers. There is the issue that sub-Saharan African countries are already highly indebted because of COVID-19, and it's very difficult for them to be able to cover the increase in their import bill of food because prices of food are going up. And finally, the potential nuclear contamination of the fields in Ukraine, which could move them out of the production equation for 10 years if this happens. So these are the risks that we are facing, and we try to reflect this through scenarios. We go from a moderate to a severe scenario. The maximum scenario is a restriction of 25 million metric tons out in the world of exports, which basically means removing Russian Federation and Ukraine from the exports. And that can move us between 7.6 million people to 13.1 million people in chronic undernourishment between 2022 and 2023, and similar numbers in the long term. Now, that is relative to a baseline, which is already increasing because of the problem that we are facing already before because of COVID-19. So the number is pretty important and big, and this is chronic undernourishment. Now, FAO has proposed 6 things plus 1 reconstruction plan for Ukraine. So we are already preparing the framework of how, in the case of agri-food systems, how we can accelerate the process of reconstruction of Ukraine if the war stops. But what are the 6 proposals? The first one for us is that we need to set up a food import facility to help countries which are in extreme situations and which need right now to cover this increase in the import bill to be able to minimize any potential risk of social unrest. We have provided a technical document with the latest data comparing the increasing costs, and I will show that so that countries can assess this. This food import facility, it can be also a control panel to monitor what is happening and what other IFIs are doing, like the World Bank or the IMF, but it should be hosted in the IMF, for example, because they have the mechanics for that. It's very important because with a small investment, you can avoid a big problem of social unrest in the future. The second proposal is on efficiencies. It's trying to gain efficiencies in the use of fertilizers. And we are proposing to deploy high technology soil maps very quickly at high resolution to be able to help producers and farmers to use more efficiently fertilizers. This is to have the proper blending. The inputs that you need, N, P, and K, depend on what you are planting and depend on what your soil has and what is the gap. In many countries, we just deploy fertilizers with fixed proportions of these inputs without looking at what is really needed. Ethiopia has been a huge example with the Ethiopia Transformation Agency on how you can increase in yields enormously while reducing the consumption of fertilizers because of the proper blending. We believe that that can save enormously the use of fertilizers and can also help to identify what technology is there to substitute. Like, for example, we are deploying right now, and we are working on a map where we show where are the soil maps today, what are the gaps, where the fertilizers are available today, and trying to see what are the differences, okay? And where we can learn from it or accelerate the process of deploying soil maps. But also the private sector is telling us that they can come with alternative solutions. Like in the case of my country, for example, they are using different blendings. They are using also manure from chicken, because we consume a lot of chicken in Peru, which is helping to smooth the process. Peru had only been able to import 10% of the fertilizers that they need. And remember, Peru is a key exporter of certain high-value commodities. Brazil, luckily, was able to procure what they needed from Russian Federation in the last 2 weeks, but many other countries are not being able to do that. And especially exporting countries now of rice, like Bangladesh, they need access to fertilizers. If not, rice, which is the only commodity which is okay today, could get into a problem next year. And that applies to Vietnam, to Thailand, and Indonesia for sure. The third proposal is to immediately deploy what we call the food insecurity experience scale at the subnational level. We have done that already during COVID-19 in 15 countries in emergency. And we believe if we deploy this in 50 countries, and we're talking of a price tag of $10 million, which is nothing, we can immediately help countries to target better the social protection programs. because there are new hotspots of food insecurity that appear with COVID-19 and will be more exacerbated, which were not in the traditional listings of the social protection programs. And if we deploy this information, we'll be able to help countries to figure out where these new hotspots are, and also to gain efficiencies in the type of programs you use. And we have deployed a proposal of all the different options that you have depending on the problem you are facing. The fifth proposal is on how to protect from potential animal health diseases to be spread. And that is basically increasing surveillance in the neighborhood countries. And finally, of course, the emergency rapid response plan, which you can download from the wage and the reconstruction of Ukraine that we are developing. Now, when we focus in Africa, what this map shows, which is basically the per capita food imports in US dollars per capita, is that it is clearly visible that coastal areas and coastal countries import much more food than inland countries. That is largely the result of natural protection, owing to high internal transportation costs and trade barriers. The outliers are Botswana, with somewhat higher imports, and Djibouti, with extremely high food imports per person. And Djibouti, for example, may re-export part of this production, so it's something to look carefully. So that said, a number of countries are exposed to high food imports and high import costs, and how high the food import bills are is very important. And that's what we want to look carefully. So this is the first table, which is the most updated you can be. We have data until 2021. Nobody has this data right now. We were able to construct for more than 150 countries this type of analysis. And basically what we are showing here is a detailed food import bill for the region and break it down by food group. To look at the problems, we have created a heat map that shows the percentage increase both for the last 2 years, so pre-COVID relative to 2019, and for relative to 2020, the last year. And what you can see here in the darker red is that the cost of raising food imports are staggering for some commodities. For instance, vegetable oils. The food import bill has risen from 76% in just 2 years. And also the cost of importing cereals are up by 28%, and those for oilseeds by 44%. And this really calls for a remedy, for a solution to this. So we therefore sat down and tried to come up with a proposal of this food import financing facility, which will allow us to use resources to minimize these risks, especially for the most vulnerable countries that are highly indebted. They cannot cover this, and this could end in significant social unrest if this doesn't happen. And this is just to show you, for example, the countries by income level that will be part of this financing facility. Remember, this food import bill is not for wheat and for maize. It's in general for all the commodities that these countries import for consumption of food. So it's just looking at food consumption. And what you can see is that many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa will qualify. And of course, you can put another dimension, another criteria to prioritize. But it's really important to understand what is this. And this is a very simple way to do it, very transparent and very clear in which we can push. Now, what this will imply? It will imply that we need to have the eligibility criteria. We need to do this as budget support. We need to put some smart conditionalities to assure that countries invest in agriculture also. And we need to add scalability. If we give 100% coverage to the change in the import bill, we're talking of $25 billion for the whole world. If we just cover 10%, we're talking of $2.5 billion. This is a very small number relative to SDRs, less than 1% of the SDRs being released. But if we just focus in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is where most of the food crisis countries are, we are talking of a compensation of $9.4 billion to assure that they cover the gap in their import bill, the change in the cost of the import bill, and in the minimum to $0.9 billion, so less than $1 billion. So it's not expensive at all, can minimize substantially the risk of these countries running into a significant problem of food insecurity, and can allow us to pass to the next season and to be able to move forward. Now, clearly, our policy recommendations are towards mobility of trade is central right now, and also of inputs. To avoid ad hoc policy reactions, any subsidies to fertilizers right now will be depleted very quickly. To diversify food supplies, increase resilience, but the food import facilities is central for us at this point. And sure, in Africa, we have to look at availability. We need to reduce any anti-agricultural bias. We need to target public support to those commodities that can raise revenues. and we need to spend better the money, and that means repurposing of subsidies. We have a report on that, increase investment in agriculture and in public goods, and we also need to improve access, and that means providing social protection programs which are very well targeted, and that's why we are proposing the deployment of the subnational fees, but also to promote free trade and accelerate the intra-regional trade agreement of Africa by reducing the NTVs, and that requires having food safety mechanisms across the board. And Codex Alimentarios play a crucial role on that. And of course, stimulate a broad-based food value chains development and finance infrastructure, essentially to also increase capacity of storage, capacity of cooling facilities, to increase resilience, and to reduce food losses, and especially behavioral change also to reduce food waste. And also have sufficient contingency funds that can finance mitigation, anticipatory actions upon evidence of a potential problem. So I stop there, and thank you so much.
Maximo, thank you very much for like a really enlightening presentation, and that's very timely and up to date, and brings us up to speed on FAO's analysis of the current food crisis. we have time for a few questions. Does anybody, if you have a question, you can put your hand up, and we can pose that question to Maximo. Anybody got a pressing question? Anybody a question for Olive Toey? Olive, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks. Hi, Maximo. Thanks so much for that presentation. It was incredible. I was thinking about the Food System Summit last year, and all the preparations that went into it, the evidence, the experience, the dialogues, and so on. And out the other side of it came the national pathways, the coalitions, and a whole lot more. And I was just wondering how this new situation relates to all of those plans that were put in place following the Food System Summit last year. Thank you.
You want me to answer one by one? Or?
Yeah, maybe we'll take a few questions. Michael O'Brien has a question also, and Nick Chisholm. So to take Michael and Nick, and then that's three, you have a bundle of three then, Maximo. Is that okay? Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Charlie, and thank you, Maximo. I'm really following up, I think, on Olive's question in relation to the Food System Summit as well, and interested in hearing your comments on how to respond to the imperative of the current food crisis and the immediate short-term needs without, I suppose, losing, the longer-term ambition that was associated with the transformation of food systems in order to reach, I suppose, the Sustainable Development Goal targets for 2030, and where you would see in terms of coordination between, I suppose, responding to the immediate, but also keeping in mind, those long-term transformational ambitions, where best, or how is that being coordinated at present? Thank you.
Nick, do you have a?
Yeah, hi, Charlie. Hi. Thanks, Maximo. It's really fascinating and detailed presentation. Just a point of clarification, more than a question in a way. I think you said in terms of projections on the impacts on undernourishment, it should be somewhere between an increase of 7 million and 13 million, depending on the scenarios. That sounded to me actually a bit on the lower side, considering the nature of the shock. So I just wondered, was that, did I get that right, or maybe you could just clarify that? Thanks.
Maximo, are you okay to take those three questions? You're muted, Maximo.
Let me start with the last one. So you have to be very careful in the way you simulate these potential impacts, okay? So the maximum scenario that we're moving is in moving out of the system 25 million metric tons, which is a very extreme scenario. If we do that, doing our model, we have a global general equilibrium model. Basically, the maximum we will have is a reduction, an increase in 13.1 million people going into chronic undernourishment. This is not acute food insecurity, which is more short-term. Now, we are comfortable with that number, which is an extreme, but we are getting close to that number because it's relative to the baseline, okay? Their baseline was already increasing. Remember, in 2020, we increased in 161 million people. So this is plus that. So that will continue to go up plus that additional. And that's why we are very comfortable at this point with that number. Of course, Things can get worse, but we hope they won't. But that's the current at least our extreme scenario. Now, regarding the other questions on the Food System Summit, look, I am a firm believer that these are also at the same time opportunities. No, it's opportunities because we are observing where a system that has shown to be resilient, okay, for the COVID-19, because nobody didn't have food in the shelves during COVID-19 and after COVID-19, is now getting another shock. And not a shock which is similar to what happened in 2011, 2007, in the sense that a chunk of the exports removed from the world. In that time, it was a drought that took out food out of the world. In this time, it's a war, okay? Now, there are big differences, no? Rice was here, rice is not here today. And rice is a very thin market. But the most important difference for me is export restrictions. Here, they were very important. Here, still they are not, but they could be. And then the situation could be worse. But the bigger difference is we are already in a very bad macroeconomic situation at the global level, plus we could be affecting the next season. That's the danger here. And also the long term, because with the change in energy mix that we are trying to do for the climate goals, we could increase the price of energy, and now we know that we will increase price of fertilizers. So that's something to take into account. Now, in that context, understanding that countries and the high concentration of exports still, despite the improvement from 2011, because we have more big exporting countries like Brazil and so on that we didn't have in 2011, 2007, still we're vulnerable. So if something else happens and a weather shock happens in Brazil or Argentina, big problem. Or Argentina puts more export restrictions, big problem. So we need to keep pushing for creating big exporting countries in the world on cereals so that we are better. And we need to do that with less resources. So we need to be efficient and sustainable. The last thing you want is to expand and destroy forests to expand the agricultural land area. So we need to be very careful. And that's where the summit and the tracks and the work that is being done in the hub and the work plan should focus. We need to focus on how to do that. And that's, for example, a role for the coalitions looking to natural resources, the agroecology, and the coalitions looking to zero hunger. But the other thing is efficiencies, no? Food loss and waste. There is a coalition that is linked to the hub. That's crucial. We could not be losing 14% of the food and wasting 17% of the food. And that is the average, okay? So for some commodities, 30, 40. So that's a big change that we also need to build the transformation to assure that that doesn't happen. We also need to understand that we need to increase resilience for shocks. And the SOFA of 2020, of FAO 2021, was exactly on that, showing what is the capacity of absorption of a shock, but also what is the recovery from that shock. And that's where I see this time an opportunity, but that will require the support of the developed countries because they sit in the boards of the IMF, of the World Bank, of the African Development Bank, that we need to coordinate the response. In COVID-19, the response, everybody went its own way. How much was touched to agriculture? Close to zero, relatively speaking. Now agriculture is the problem again. Are we going to coordinate these agencies or they are going to push whatever they think is the correct way to go? I think it's very, very important that there is this change in the governance, not in the governance of the UN agencies. No, the problem are not, the money is not in the UN agencies. The UN agencies are very poor. The big money is in the IFIs. The big money is in the IMF, the big money is in the World Bank, in the African Development Bank, in the Asian Development Bank, in all the regional banks, and in the private sector. So if we don't start to put pressure on them to coordinate better and to use the evidence to make the responses that are needed and not to create more subsidies and distortions, because if we look at the repurposing, $540 billion being used in subsidies when are going against access to healthy diets and against nature and climate, then we need to create a big transformation in that sense. So I think, on the contrary, I don't think that this shock should be affecting the medium and long-term transformation that is needed. We need to accelerate it, but we need some window of time. And if we don't react to help the most vulnerable countries right now, like through the import facility or whatever other facility, but very well designed, then we could end into a problem of social unrest, and that will blow up the situation, and countries will start to put more export restrictions and will create problems. Today, we are looking at many people saying, we have the farm proposal, we have the German proposal, We have what the World Bank is doing, what the IMF is trying to do, zero coordination. Okay, and basically what we will end doing is destroying things that work, like the AMIs, because you are going to lose power when we need to empower things that we know has worked in the past. So again, my point here is we have to resolve the short-term problem. We need to find a way to move fertilizers out of Russia. They are not part of the sanctions, but financial mechanisms are part of the sanctions, but there are options like what Brazil did. We need to find that a solution. We need to see if we can move some of the grain out of Ukraine, and the war should stop for sure. I am completely in favor of stopping immediately the war, but we need to find solutions very quickly to assure that the next planting season is okay, and at the same time continue focusing on the bigger transformation. But it's not only of the agri-food system, but it's also of the financial system and the bigger institutions in the world, the Bretton Woods institutions, so that they coordinate more.
Thanks, Maximo. I'm just going to follow up on just one question. So like with every shock, global shock that we have, whether it's climate, COVID, or conflict related, there are always calls for building back better, building back greener, building back more equitably, and transitions and transformation narratives. Yeah, essentially. Do you think that the transformations and transitions are happening at the pace and scale necessary? And in a nutshell, do you think our food systems are becoming more resilient over time?
No, look, it's the opposite, no? I think we keep using this labeling like Build Back Better that was pushed by some big IFIs and Build Back Better Greener, and they never talk about agriculture. There was no one word referring to agriculture. Now, if you want to build back better and reduce extreme poverty and reduce chronic undernourishment, if you don't touch agriculture, you are not going to do it never. If you want to be back better and be greener, and you don't look at the methane emissions from agriculture, you will never be able to do it. So again, we have, I think we have a serious institutional problem right now, and this is the job of the developed countries. They are the ones that have the bigger shares in all these agencies, and they need to ask questions. They need to be more severe in the way resources are being used, because if not, we will never be back better. We will be back worse, because we will create more problems, more distortions, and more effects over nature, and so on. And we are doing an effort now to measure the real cost of food, because it's something that will help a lot to see the consequences of our actions. But again, I think that we need to stop this labeling, and things need to be questioned more in a more serious way, not just in the media. It needs to be seriously questioned, and that's the reason of the boards. I was in the board of the World Bank. I know it is possible to do it, and I know it's uncomfortable to ask tough questions to the members and to the management, but it's time to start doing that. And that's the role of developed countries, which have the bigger role in these boards.